just like a moment, like wait a few more moments to see if anyone else joins us. Okay, I guess we'll start, and as people trickle in, they'll join the meeting. Welcome everyone. I'm really thrilled. I'm very excited to see everybody here today. As you may know, this is our first series, of a series, a new series at McGill being hosted by the Office for Science Education. The series is part of SciLearn, which is a new program that we began last year, a little bit more than a year ago, to help students make the transition to university learning. So up to this point, we've really been working with students on getting them more familiar with how their brain works, how learning works, and what they can do to really ramp up their own abilities to learn in the university environment. But we also want to focus on the other side of the equation. What can instructors do to really take the most out of recent research and apply back to their own teaching efforts in the classroom or on Zoom, in the virtual classroom and in the face-to-face classroom? So today we have invited Dr. Joe Kim from McMaster University, and we're very, very honored to have him launch this series with us. We will introduce him in a moment, but before I hand over the mic, so to speak, to Hillary, I just want to thank our funders for donating the funding, for providing the funding for SciLearn and making all these initiatives possible. So that is Marie DeMazzo from the DeMazzo Family Foundation. Thank you very much. And also the Faculty of Science, who's really been supporting the Office of Science Education since we began our efforts about 3 years ago. So thanks everyone, and really hope you will enjoy this wonderful session. Hillary?
Great, thank you so much, Marcy. So I just wanted to very briefly start off today by acknowledging that the land and the area that we're all residing and working on today has been a long-serving meeting place and traditional land of many different people, depending on where you are zooming in from today. So it's a little bit harder to do this knowing that we're all coming from different places. So I'm just going to share a link with you in the chat where you can go and see who the traditional custodians of the current land that you're residing on are. So I did this myself, and I learned that living in Montreal near McGill, I am on the land of the Kanakahaki people who are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And it's really important, I think, that we just keep this in our minds today as we're kind of discussing this intersection of science and education, because the Indigenous people and the knowledge that they have built over the years has really shaped and continues to shape the way that we interact with the world and the way we practice science, and also the way that we practice education. So really looking into Indigenous ways of knowing can help us create these really rich educational experiences. So I encourage you all to go and check out that link this afternoon, or maybe on this weekend. Look into the Indigenous leaders in your area and see how you can draw upon that in your educational experiences. So with that being said, I just want to introduce you all to our wonderful speaker today, Dr. Joe Kim. So Dr. Kim is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Behavior at McMaster University. And he is a very busy guy. He's got a lot of roles, which are all intersecting at his interest in implementing evidence-based practices to promote lifelong learning. So just briefly, his first role is as the director of the Education and Cognition Lab at McMaster, where they primarily study how attention, memory, and learning can be applied to improve education and training. He's also the faculty director of the McCall-McBain Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, where they are giving postdoctoral fellows across the university training in teaching and leadership. And finally, he's also the principal instructor for McMaster Intro to Psychology, which is a large scale, but we are actually talking this morning, it's a gigantic scale course of over 6,000 students. And they take a combined approach with traditional lectures, interactive online resources, and small group tutorials, and has been heavily featured in things like Maclean's Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and numerous other educational media outlets. So we are very privileged to have Dr. Kim speaking here with us today and kicking off our series. And with that, I will hand it to you, Dr. Kim. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just looking at my video. I don't know what's going on with the lighting in this room, but I keep going in and out of shadows in my own room. It's perfectly bright in here, so I don't know what's going on. Just another one of the challenges, I guess, of teaching and giving presentations in a pandemic. So if you think of other issues that come along the way while I'm giving this talk about the biggest challenges that you see to teaching and learning in the pandemic, please feel free to share it on chat. Look forward to hearing your thoughts. Now, I want you to think right now about a motivated learner, someone who really just cares about learning. They not necessarily, I don't mean necessarily grades, that they want to get the highest possible grade. They're just curious about the world. They want to understand how things work. Okay, are you picturing that person? Well, I live with someone like that. This is my daughter, Monica, and here she is just testing out the hypothesis of whether or not she can catch snowflakes on her eyelashes. Why? Why not? When she turned 4, she asked me the classic kids question: does the light in the fridge go out when you close the door? And so rather than just reflexively give her an answer, I looked at her and I said, I don't know. What do you think? And she said, I don't know either, but we're going to find out. And so I said, well, how are we going to find out? And she sat for a while and she thought, okay, let's take everything out of the fridge. Take out the shelves. I'll go inside. You close the door and I'll tell you what happens. And I said, well, legally, we can't do that. But can you think of another solution? And she sat for a while and thought. And then she said, can I borrow your phone? I said, sure. What are we doing? We're making a movie. And so here's the movie. This is experiment for what?
For seeing if the fridge turns off.
The light turns off when we close the fridge?
Yeah.
Here we go. Spoiler alert, the light goes out. Okay, so I teach introductory psychology. And as Hillary was saying, it's a gigantic course. Believe it or not, just at McMaster University, every year we have over 6,000 students take this course. And there's various levels of motivation within this large group of students, different backgrounds. Some people haven't taken a science course since grade 11. Lots of different perspectives. And so there's a lot of challenges with teaching a large introductory psychology course. Maybe the biggest challenge is that there's so much stuff to go through. Because it's an introductory level survey course, I'm trying to cover the entire field of psychology in 2 semesters. And so I want students to be able to consume this information, but not just to memorize all of these, let's say hundreds of facts that they encounter across the course. I want them to master them. I want them to use this information to change their life. And so the way that I'm going to test that is I want them to retain this knowledge and be able to apply it in novel situations. So memorizing the definition of independent variable, that's not enough. I mean, you can just Google that. But if I give you an experiment and I ask you what's the independent variable here and why, that's a useful bit of knowledge. And so that's a level of mastery that I'm trying to get at in teaching this course. So how do we teach 6,000 students? Well, we don't have a lecture hall that holds 6,000 students. So what we use is a blended learning model. And so Whereas a classic course in university that you might have taken, there were 3 lectures a week, and that's where you come to get your primary course content. And if you miss something, well, the lecture just keeps going on. So what we've done is we've taken all of that primary course content and created interactive online web modules. And they're pretty good. The students actually really like them. They rate them very highly. If you're curious and you want to check one out, go to macintropsych.com and you could see one of our sample web modules. So this provides a self-paced learning tool. So if you don't understand something, you can go back and review that unit. In fact, we have checkpoint questions at the end of every unit within a single web module, and students are explicitly told, this isn't for grades, but if you get these basic recall questions wrong, go back and review. Sometimes when we're covering very complex or mechanistic material, like the steps of an action potential, I even explicitly say at the end of this unit, you know, I don't care if your name is Hubel or Weasel. That was a lot of stuff that we just went through. You might want to go back and review this particular unit before moving on. So this gives all the students in the class a chance at their own self-paced learning to gain mastery of the basic concepts. This sets up everyone for their in-person lecture on Monday. So we have these students divided into large lecture hall sections, co-taught by myself and Dr. Michelle Cadieux. And this is an opportunity for us to almost give like a TED talk to the students of why is this week's course content important? Why do you need to know this? How does this change your understanding of fake news? Or how does this change your understanding of a very important problem on the internet, such as what color is this dress? Or whatever meme is very topical at the moment. And so we always do demonstrations, interactive activities, discussions. And even when I moved this online, I was blown away at the student participation. So I deliver these lectures currently online through Teams. And I have 2 TAs that are constantly monitoring the chat. So the students are in sections of about 600 to 700. And in one given lecture, we typically have hundreds of comments. You know, I think the record we had was over 600 comments in one single lecture. What's really interesting is that some of these questions are just, oh, what does he mean by dorsal ventral? And then the TA immediately responds, and then the student, okay, I get it. And then they can go on with the rest of that lecture. And sometimes I'm explicitly soliciting comments. So when we're talking about in groups and out groups, you know, I'll ask them, you know, what do you think the 3 typical characteristics are of a McMaster University student? Well, what are the 3 typical characteristics of a McGill student? They're not as good. And so you can actually see this in-group, out-group difference demonstrated live, and students love seeing their own interactions. There's a lot more I can say about that, but I'll leave that for now. And then students in this gigantic course are also assigned to a small group tutorial of 20 to 25 students. And so they actually come in person, even right now, this semester on campus. They go through with their peers, led by an undergraduate teaching assistant that takes a course with me called The Science of Learning. So they are fully trained educators. We preview every Friday the upcoming week's tutorial together so that they're fully prepared. The students in the class love the tutorials. They're always highly rated, where they get to do problem-based learning activities. Okay, so 1 year, all 3 of these components I think are really important for the success of the course. So 1 year, we happen to give 3 different versions of the exact same course. So one course was purely online, and there's actually a demand for this at our university, a completely online course where there's no class component. You just have your tests and your final exam. Another version using those same web modules, but you also had to come for an in-person tutorial, as I described. And the third version sort of is the deluxe blended learning, where there's also a weekly lecture. So when we look at student self-reported satisfaction through their course evaluations, the purely online experience is just under a 7 out of 10. When they have to actually also come in for a tutorial, it moves up to about an 8. And when you also have to come in for a lecture, it moves up to a 9 out of 10. And so as we add work here, the students actually report higher satisfaction. So we were able to compare how students actually performed because they had the exact same tests and final exam. And then we can see that there's a stepwise function. So as you add more interactive class time, the performance of the class actually also goes up. Okay, now let's take a look at, there's a question from Jack. If you want to take your microphone off.
Yeah, I was just curious what the sort of error bars are on those numbers.
This is unpublished data. It's not an experiment for sure.
Did you have like a gut
yeah,
idea about
so,
how big?
Yeah, the differences are significant. There's lots of things that I could definitely criticize. There's no random assignments. We're never going to have a study that we do that. But for me, I thought it was really interesting to see that, adding the different components, maybe it makes students more engaged. Okay.
Thanks.
So, yeah, Jack?
Oh, I said thanks.
Okay. Let's look at this problem of, the volume of information that you have to take in and retaining it. So how do students approach this? Well, one thing that we know from cognitive psychology is that in general, human beings make poor metacognitive judgments about learning, especially your own learning. So Donlosky and colleagues did a meta-analysis of various different lab-controlled and classroom-based studies. And they examined the most commonly used and available techniques. And perhaps not surprisingly, from a student perspective, the most popular methods used for preparing for a test were highlighting and rereading the notes or textbook. Why? Because that's probably the last useful strategy that worked as you transition from high school to university. So they were probably the best students in high school. And especially if you had tests that mainly rewarded recall and recognition and how good you were at memorizing, these methods were probably just fine. However, across these different studies, they rated the lowest in utility. So even though you're investing in these strategies, you're not getting as much on return compared to other strategies that you might employ. But let's put ourselves in the shoes of a person who is employing these strategies. So imagine you're sitting at a desk, maybe for hours on end, and you're very busy. You're turning pages from one color into another. There's no doubt that physical labor has taken place. I mean, here's the evidence in front of you. Not only that, you can read the same sentences faster and faster. So this creates what we call a sense of fluency. And then sometimes the big temptation here is to misattribute that fluency with mastery of the content. So just because you could read something faster and faster doesn't mean that you actually have mastered that concept and you really understand it and can apply it into a novel situation. Well, how about on the instructor or instructional design end? You probably are carrying in the same experiences and biases. You probably were the best student in your high school. And maybe use some of these techniques to carry you into university. So very few, if any, faculty member really has explicit training in effective strategies about the science of learning and education and cognition, which might inform instructional design. And so our prior experiences might be driving some of the educational practices that we employ. So one of these things I talk about is in my introductory psychology class is this idea of learning styles. So the idea of learning styles is very intuitive. It's appealing. So people have different preferences for how to learn, such as visual, auditory, kinesthetic. And the idea is that if we can match this up with the teaching, you will improve your academic performance. And so this is a very popular theory. If you Google learning theory, learning styles, you'll get tens of thousands of hits, most of them in favor of learning styles. And the popularity of it has grown so that there's some extensions. So if learning styles, if we could come up with a test to diagnose what type of learning style is your preference, maybe we should do that as early as possible. And there are some preschools that run modified tests about learning styles and then literally label their children with the hope that this will improve their performance. Unfortunately, there's a good article by Pashler here that you can read. There's no direct evidence. There's no actual data that supports this intuitively pleasing idea. And it's grown into a bit of a monster. There's not just 3 learning styles. There's several dozen learning styles and probably more that are being discovered as we speak. You know things are bad when the online satirical newspaper, The Onion, starts weighing in. Parents of nasal learners demand odor-based curriculum. So, this isn't something that's just funny. If you are investing time and resources into this. So here is a poster from a very well-meaning teacher who's heard about kinesthetic, auditory, visual learners. There's even a diagnostic here. You can actually, it's actually a multi-million-dollar business doing psychometric testing for learning styles, but apparently you could do a quick and easy one. If you're a visual learner, they tend to look upwards. And if you look to the left or if you look to the right, that might indicate you're another type of learning style. Anyway, this is just one example of many different myths about learning. And my colleagues and I thought learning styles was actually something that could be put to rest. But it still comes up and I'm asked about it all the time. And so my colleagues and I actually have a book coming out that we hope might be a definitive word on the evidence that's lacking for our strong belief in learning styles. Okay, so as Hilary mentioned, there's 3 major roles that I have. And I think what's in common with all of these roles that I have at McMaster is that I'm really interested in durable learning. So I mean, learning that persists beyond the upcoming test, maybe to the final exam, and hopefully maybe even beyond the final exam, when a student of mine is taking a course for which my introductory course was a prerequisite, or they're making some decisions in their life and they think about confirmation bias and availability heuristic and how that might be impacting their perception of the world. So we'll talk about 3 things in our remaining time that lead to durable learning. So learning begins with effortful and focused attention, something that might seem completely obvious, but is much more difficult to actually apply. And then I know we have instructional designers in our audience today, and it really does set the stage for learning. So a faculty member who has training can really create the optimal environment for learning for their students. And I'll give you one extended example of that. And then finally, to set up Dr. Faryasana's workshop next week, we'll scratch the surface a bit about effective study habits that strengthen this long-term retention. So let's begin with this first point, that learning begins with effortful and focused attention. So if you happen to not be a cognitive psychologist and you want to add a book to your reading list, read this one. It's really good. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It summarizes a lifetime of research led by Kahneman and colleagues about decision-making and how the mind works. And Kahneman uses this metaphor of two different systems of thinking. There's the hare. It's fast, it's reflexive, it relies on our intuitions, our previous experiences, our biases, and heuristics. And then there's the tortoise. It's slow, it's effortful. It's what we really need to make deep connections. And so one of the things that I really encourage my students to do in my class is to engage in effortful and focused attention. So let's do a little quick test here. Are you thinking fast or slow? So here's an actual question that I asked my students on the first day of class. It's from a famous test called the cognitive reflection test. There's no trick here. I just want you to answer this question. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does each item cost? So I want you in your mind right now to just commit yourself to an answer. Now, I'll warn you that half the students in my class get this question wrong. So if you thought that the answer was $1.10, you're wrong. The answer is 5 cents and $1.05. So how can we get that? Well, if the bat costs $1 more than the ball, let's take that off the total. We're left with 10 cents, and we have to divide that 10 cents between the two items. So we end up with 5 cents and $1 plus 5 cents. So that's $1.05 and 5 cents. That's a $1 difference. Okay, if you happen to get that question wrong, that's fine. Hopefully you followed along with my explanation. Now, the next question I ask my students is, if I put this question on the final exam, would you get it right? This time, 100% of the students say, of course, we would get this question right. But remember, I don't want them to just memorize information. I want them to be able to retain that knowledge and apply it in a novel situation. So here's the same question. A BMW and a Tesla cost $160,000. The BMW costs $100,000 more than the Tesla. How much does each car cost? Believe it or not, some of these students get this question wrong. This is the exact same question with different surface features. Okay, so what do I mean by focused? Well, especially in a pandemic situation, we're all working at home. There's a garbage truck going on behind me. My dog keeps coming up to me, wanting to go for a walk. Maybe, hopefully not, but maybe some of you have multiple things going on your computer at a time. You wouldn't do that, right? Vero, you're laughing. Okay. Well, that leads to divided attention. And, a study by my co-lab director, Faryasana, really demonstrates this. So to set up this study, imagine that all of you are in an actual classroom with me. I'm about to give a lecture and you're told, pay attention. There's going to be tests to see how well you understood, what was delivered in this lecture. Unknown to you is that spread out throughout this lecture hall are Confederates who are in on the experiment. They're the only ones with a laptop. You don't. Sometimes they're not paying attention. Sometimes they start emailing or sending videos or sending a message. You're not doing that because you don't have a laptop. But depending on where you're placed in this lecture hall, maybe you have a view of a multitasking peer, or maybe you don't. And so an interesting question we could compare here is how does the peer distraction affect comprehension of these students that don't even have a computer? And there's a significant difference in comprehension just by whether or not someone else is acting in a distracted manner. So when you think about your own work screen, if you have lots of different things going on, if you have your mail icon going and it starts blinking, the badge number goes up, and you tell yourself, no, I'm going to write this report, I'm going to prepare this lecture, I'm not going to give in. Part of your mind is already preoccupied. You're thinking, I wonder what that email is. Is it about that report I was supposed to write? Is it some kind of fun video? Is it? I don't know what it is, but no, I'm not going to open it. So, one of the things I try to get my students to buy in on the first day, there's several things I establish. I start the lecture right on time. I use the entire lecture period, and I try to create an environment where students are motivated, engaged, and are paying attention. So the very first thing I do, the opening few moments of every lecture, my goal is to capture their attention and almost prove to them, hey, what we're about to talk about today, it's going to change your life. You should pay attention. And that's how I really feel with every lecture. You could compare that to a situation where I've seen instructors come in and say, well, we got a lot of stuff to do. Let's get to it. Slide 1, bang. Slide 2, 3, 4, 5, with no, engagement of attention at all. So part of this is also, a test of self-regulation. Can you, put aside this immediate gratification for this later reward? And so this is something that psychologists are interested in as well. And so when my daughter was 4, I tried out a test on her. It's a famous test in psychology called the marshmallow test. And kids like my daughter, when she was 4, really like marshmallows. And so the rules are, you can have 1 marshmallow right now, but if you can wait 15 minutes, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And I jokingly tell my students that Monica was trained for 4 years for this test. I think that's just what Korean parents do. And the way that she was trained was that when we went shopping, if I bought some sort of treat, when we got to the car, I'd give it to her and say, hey, look what we're going to have. Not now, later. After dinner, we're going to eat this for dessert. And so, at first she thought this was strange, but then she kind of learned that, yeah, I guess this is normal. There were several important things. I always followed through with my promise. We would always have it later. If she forgot, I would remind her. And so she really learned this self-regulation behavior and could delay immediate gratification early on. And she's 10 now. And I would say, honestly, this behavior, this has really persisted with her. And I think it's a very helpful tool to have. And so I tell my students, if a 4-year-old can delay immediate gratification for 15 minutes, maybe you can. And if you can do 15 minutes, maybe you can do 30 minutes. If you can do 30 minutes, maybe you can do 45 minutes. And if you could do 45 minutes, you could change the world. So sometimes students have to study for longer than 45 minutes or even an hour. So one of the things that we're interested in my lab is this concept called mind wandering. So maybe while you're paying attention right now, you're starting to think, hey, I haven't eaten breakfast yet. I wonder what I'm going to eat. What do I have in the fridge? What are the other things that I have to do? So these are all moving to a secondary task when hopefully your primary task is paying attention to this keynote. So along this graph here, we could also plot things like attention, motivation, and energy levels. And let's say at the beginning, it's very high. And then as you increase your time on a complex cognitive task, like teaching, that's going to go down. And at some point, there might even be a precipitous drop in these levels. So that might be actually a good time to introduce a strategic break, especially when you're just stuck at home in a pandemic. Now, there's some interesting research by Mark Berman that demonstrates, one of the best things that you could do is go for a 30-minute walk in nature. Not just anywhere. actually a 30-minute walk in nature is even better than a 30-minute walk through a busy cityscape. And so, I've had a chance, especially during the pandemic, where I shifted my office hours to be online. And one of the topics that comes up a lot is, getting exercise into your daily schedule. So some of the adjustments I've made is that I have several meetings while I'm walking. So I think I saw Connie online here, and a lot of our meetings, I just shift to a phone meeting so that I can go for a walk. I'm lucky to live right by a nature trail. And so during our half-hour to 1-hour meeting, I'm walking the dog and having a talk. And that's just kind of a built-in feature to my day to make sure that I get some restorative exercise. So this was actually an interesting topic that we've looked at, interactions between physical exercise and cognitive processes. So we were thinking about how exercise breaks could be strategically introduced during extended study periods. Why? Well, there's some interesting theoretical reasons why exercise might be a particularly good type of break. So in one study, we had students in the control group studying 1 week's worth of complex course material. This was on the neuroscience of form perception, a topic that students typically find very challenging. We had one group, the control group, study straight with no breaks. This was sort of like the hero condition. And there are some students that report, yeah, if I got something to get through, I'm going to go to the library. I'm not going to even get up, maybe just to go to the washroom, and I'll just sit there for hours until I get something. But I think there's a problem with that, with this diminishing return on the time investment. If you keep reading the same sentence over and over again, and you can't remember it, it's probably a sign that your attention, motivation, and energy levels are low. So we had a group where we strategically introduced 5-minute breaks where they got to do something fun and rewarding. They got to play a computer game. And another group, we matched the same break times, but instead of playing a computer game, they had a bit of a context shift where they engaged in exercise, high intensity interval training exercise for 5 minutes. Why? Well, that's something McMaster University is known for doing research on. So the first thing we looked at is attention. We looked at attention in the first half to the second half of study. And what you typically see is a decline in attention. And this was true for the control group. It was also true for the computer game breaks group, which was interesting. If you take a break and you just play computer games, it doesn't really do anything to help keep your attention levels high in the second half of study. But the exercise breaks groups, hooray, they maintained their attention from the first half to the second half of study. We were then interested to see, well, how does that impact comprehension on a test, both immediately and delayed 2 days later, a different test that tested the same material. And what we found was that the exercise breaks group significantly outperformed the non-exercise breaks groups. And it's an interesting area of research. We're looking at different types of breaks right now. Not everyone has access to a nature trail, right? 5-minute walk from their house. And you might not have 30 minutes to take a break. But I saw Zoom fatigue in the chat. And I've seen people or spoken with colleagues where you might have 5 or 6 hours of Zoom meetings in a row with no break at all. And the question is, how productive are you in that third hour? Are you even paying attention to what's going on? And the honest answer is no, you're not. And so by putting in some sort of 5-minute break at the end of the hour, where you have a chance to reset yourself, give yourself a context shift, I think is vitally important and something that I'm really interested in looking at. What these 5-minute breaks have in common, I think, is that they're restorative in nature. They can shift the context and give you a chance to replenish your energy, your attention, and your motivation levels. Okay, so I want you to think about the scenario where you're teaching in a long, sustained task. So the 3-hour night class. So what many instructors do at the first day of class is say, everyone, I'm going to give you an option. We can have a couple of breaks and then we're going to go right to the end, or I'll try to rush through as quickly as I can and then you get to leave early. Now, if you leave it up to the students, everyone's going to pick the second option. No one wants to stay there to the end. But what our research and from others would suggest is that you're far better off actually putting in strategic breaks into your learning than to just try to rush through everything to let people out early. Now, other things you can do, of course, is that not just make it a passive delivery of information, but try to make it as interactive as possible. And so let me give you a couple examples. So when I'm talking about face perception and signal detection, one of the activities I might ask my students is that, which of these Monicas do you think is lying by just looking at her facial expressions?
One of my favorite things to do is wear a very fancy dress. One of my favorite things to do is to make slime. My favorite animal is the mongoose. They're so cute and adorable.
Okay, I want you to take a moment right now and pick A, B, or C. And then on the count of 3, enter in your answer into the chat. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, no, not many people picked A. The correct answer is B. Very good. Here's another example. Having iClicker or some sort of question in the middle of your lecture. So I typically do this a few times in my lectures. And sometimes they could lead into interesting breakout room or discussion activities. Okay, so learning begins with effortful and focused attention. It's something that seems completely obvious, but I think it's something that you have to actually really think about as an instructor, and think about the limitations of the cognitive resources of yourself and your learners, and then to put in strategic breaks. So you could reduce attention lapses with things like quiz questions and active learning, and really making a connection with your audience right at the beginning of the presentation. And then when longer learning hour sessions are required, make sure you do really have a restorative activity. So if I'm teaching a 3-hour class, I'm never going to just go straight through. I will definitely make sure I put in, a restorative break opportunity. Okay. The second thing I want to really focus on, especially since we have instructional designers here, is the critical role in training and thinking about instructional design. So sometimes faculty members think, well, I just know how to teach because I've been a student my entire life and I've gotten this far. But there's many different things we can think about, and many different examples I can draw upon, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about multimedia design principles. The first thing that we have to really understand from a cognitive perspective is that we overestimate how much information we can process with our limited attentional resources. So right now, there's a lot of different competing stimuli for the sensory information. And I'm hoping that the message I'm giving to you will get encoded into your long-term memory. But the bottleneck here is working memory capacity. And right, so what I can do as an instructional designer is to design the materials at a macro and a micro level that will help information get packaged through this bottleneck, and that encoded into a person's existing framework of knowledge. And let me just give you an example to show you, to prove to you, the limits of our attentional resources. I'm about to show you a sentence, and I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. You're going to read one word of the sentence and then categorize it. If it's a noun, you will say yes. If it is not a noun, you will say no. Okay. Okay. Anyone who wants to try this out loud, unmute your microphone right now. Okay. Here we go. So are the instructions clear? So you'll read the first word of the sentence, then say yes or no. The second word of the sentence, then say yes or no, and then continue through the entire sentence. Here we go. The, no. Cat, yes.
Yes.
Was, no.
No.
Content, no.
No.
In, no.
No.
The, no.
No.
Barn, yes.
Yes.
With, no.
No.
The, no.
No.
Mice, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Brendan, thanks. I mean, I think you're the only brave person that actually went along with me, but hopefully you're kind of doing this on your own. So a couple things to note. The entire sentence, went through your visual system. You scanned from left to right. You actually, you might have been repeating the words and you might have heard me saying it. But here's my challenge to you. What was the sentence that you just read? I can see Brendan thinking. Something about a cat, something about a barn, but I bet you didn't get the full sentence. The cat was content in the barn with the mice. Even though you took in the visual information, you listened to the visual information, and this and many other little cognitive tricks I could show you demonstrate the limits of our attentional resources. And there's a cost to task switching. So I'm drawing upon this example because I want you to think about the typical slide in your slide deck. Maybe kind of looks like this. And maybe it all comes up at once like this. And so what is a student going to be doing in a situation like this? Well, they're probably trying to listen to you earnestly, but they're also trying to read what's on that screen. They're kind of going back and forth. They're experiencing what we call cognitive overload. They can't possibly do this. And so what they'll typically do is stop listening to the instructor and start writing down everything on the screen as quickly as possible. And so there are actually many different multimedia principles that have been established. And this is a whole other 3 hour to 1 day presentation. But let me just give you some highlights. So here's an actual slide that an instructor used. All of this came up at once in this business class. And yeah, what are you going to do? You're not going to even be listening. You're just going to be trying to madly copy this down as quickly as possible. And so the same information can be presented. You could explain the different stages. You could explain that there's a timeline for rollout, and there are key things that have to get done at a certain order, at a certain time in order for this project to make sense. And I'm not really doing this justice because I don't know what this lecture really is about, but you could imagine how a person can understand this much better. Now, let's say you have a really good looking slide. Let's say you're giving a talk about different types of seating arrangements that you should compare in a classroom. Well, what does this picture have to do with what this person is saying? Absolutely nothing. But how about this slide? This slide actually shows the 3 classroom arrangements that are being compared. And you can see it's a much superior slide. We've done a lot of research on this in the lab, and what we've demonstrated is that even when students are listening to the exact same narrative, if you have different types of slides paired with it, you will improve academic performance. So in a controlled lab study, we see a 12% boost. People are listening to the exact same lecture. They just have different slides, and they will perform significantly better. So your job as an instructor is to help focus learner attention through better designed presentations. So let me just walk you through one more study here. So Catherine Overson has done some great translational research where she's taken the lab findings of multimedia learning principles, like we've done in my lab, and then taken it to the actual classroom. So she's an instructional designer. She asked for volunteers at her university to send her their slides. So if you've been teaching the same course for years, you have your slide decks ready. And then she randomly selected half the lectures for a given instructor and then touched up the slides. according to multimedia principles. So let me give you an example. Here's a typical slide from an epidemiology class. And she took that same information and made it more visual and organized. And keep in mind, she is not an epidemiologist. So for all of these different variety of courses, she gave back the slides and said, just make sure everything is still accurate. Go ahead and do your regular teaching. So on some lectures, they were teaching from their typical slides. And on some lectures, they were teaching from their modified slides. Now, she told me that anecdotally, no one thought this would make a difference. They thought, I've been teaching this course for years. I'm the subject matter expert. It won't matter. The end of every lecture, there was a test. And so you could compare on an immediate timeline, is there an improvement? And yes, there was about a 10 to 15% improvement across these different courses on the days that the modified slides were used. This translated into long-term benefits on the midterm and final exams. So there are many things that are outside of the control of the instructor, but one thing that's always in your control is your own presentation and your own slide design. Okay. Now, in the last few moments, I just want to give you a bit of a preview for next week when Dr. Faria Sana will be talking about the actual techniques that we think are very promising. So practice testing, distributed practice, and interleave practice. The one that you've probably heard about is practice testing. And so here's the classic study. Imagine you're reading short passages. These are, I think, GRE passages. So it takes you 5 minutes to read a passage. And then for some passages, you read it for 5 minutes, and then you come back on 3 more occasions to reread the same passage. So this is the study or rereading type of passage. Another type of passage, you're going to read it once for 5 minutes. Then on 3 more occasions, you're going to have to come back and you're going to be recalling what are the key points of that passage. So in total for these 2 types of passages, you will have equal time on both. The only difference is what happens after trial 1, whether you reread or you study or you actually test yourself. Then we can look at the impact on comprehension immediately, 5 minutes after you've done reading the passages, or 1 week later for long-term durable learning. So if you ask a person who read these studies, which one of these passages do you think you will remember better? Not surprisingly, people will say, well, the passage I read 4 times, I'm going to remember better than the passage I only read once. But let's see how they actually perform. So we'll look at 5 minutes after you've done your reading and 1 week after you've done your reading. Now, 5 minutes after you've done your reading, not surprisingly, yeah, the passage you read 4 times, you remember more of the information than the passage you read once. But what happens 1 week later where there's no studying in between? You can see in the gray bars, there's a massive drop in the passage that you read 4 times. But the passage you only read once, but challenge your memory to retrieve, you retain much more of that information. And so when you combine things like with practice testing with interleaving and spacing, you get very robust learning through something called successive relearning. And that's something that Faria will talk about more next class. So there's little ways that you could build this directly into the structure of your course. So I always start off my lectures with some sort of question along these lines, like what's something interesting that you learned last class? Or if I ask some sort of review question, I'll always explicitly make connections with material that we discussed last week. So what does tonotopic organization, something we're learning about this week with audition, how does it differ from topographic organization of vision, something that we learned the previous week? So this is something that's just kind of built into the habits of the students. A typical university course has infrequent high stakes testing. So in my course, we have frequent low stakes testing. So there's a test every week. There's feedback given every week leading to the final exam. So next week, that's what Dr. Sana will go through, these 3 different methods. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of my talk today. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope I made the case for why it's important to use cognitive principles to inform evidence-based practices to teaching, because in the absence of using evidence-based practice, instructors and students are going to rely on their prior experiences, their biases, and their intuitions, which may or may not actually line up with the research data. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. That was super interesting, and I know we have lots of people waiting to ask their questions. So just before we move into a couple of questions, we are going to take a couple minutes at the end, maybe just 2 minutes to do a short closing, and we can maybe take 1 or 2 questions in the meantime. And then Dr. Kim, if you are available to stay later, which is fine. If you're not, others can stick around to ask more questions. So